David and Dustin.
I'm supposed to be, I am on. Excellent. Well, I'm the English half of the duo, and because I got a funny accent, Dustin asked me to do most of the speaking. I'm going to say we a lot of the time, because this was a very important collaboration between a design and planning professional and a real estate and development professional. That is really at the core of everything that we are going to be talking about. So we are going to make this PDF available after, so you don't have to write everything down. I am not going to read the slides. I'm actually going to summarize things. You can read them, you can make notes, you can look at the pictures. Every slide's got a picture. But we begin with a basic definition, and this actually is very important. 1 and 2. Strict controls on external form and scale to define the character of a neighborhood. And in fact, more than one city doesn't use form-based codes, which is one of these sort of neutral, wonky type terms. But community character codes, that's a term that's beginning to be more used, because it gets at the heart of what a form-based code tries to do. It puts the character of a place, it's a place-making mechanism. And so strict controls on the external form, the bits of the buildings that make public space, streets, squares, plazas. And having done that, it provides broad flexibility, a lot of flexibility in allowable land uses. Not a total free-for-all in terms of use, but wide latitude to respond to market conditions. And most importantly, by right entitlements. That's at the heart of things, and you'll see this repeated on several slides. If you do this, if you follow the good urban design principles in the code, you get these rewards. The idea is to increase predictability and reduce risk, and to meet the expectations of the broader community for whom you're involved in being a part of making their future. So a basic proposition follows from that, and that's in italics, just to make sure that at its heart, the idea of form-based coding is not to add on layers of stuff, it's to reduce the load of regulatory bureaucracy that you have to deal with as a developer. The other thing, if, is in capitals, because like most things, you've got to do it right. If you go to the dentist, you expect the dentist to do it right? Not sort of mess up your teeth too much. It'll hurt. So if you're making a form-based code, you've got to do it right. And we are going to talk a little bit about what doing it right means, and then we're going to talk about what happens when you do it wrong. So again, your repetition being I've been a teacher for nearly 40 years. If you've got a basic message, say it, and say it again, and say it again, and say it again. So I'm saying it again. If you follow more explicit rules of urban design, you get quicker approvals and by right entitlements with market flexibility. That's if the process is done correctly by the municipality, with neighborhood buy-in, and as developers as the crucial agent of implementation. So, 4 questions. A little soupçon of history, don't worry too much. There's like 3 slides about history, and then it's over. But it's important you know where it comes from. What is good practice? What can and does go wrong? And very importantly, how can form-based codes encourage economic development? Because they're a place-making device. And the presumption is that when you make great places that people want to be, that's one of the best economic development tools, mechanisms you could possibly have. If we want to, we can go all the way back to 2100 BC. We're just going to note that. We're not going to go there, but we're going to note that form-based codes are not something, thought up by architects and urban designers in the 1980s. You've all heard of somewhere called Seaside by Andres Duany and Liz Plater-Zyberk. That's sometimes the little homeowners agreement code that they had there is in many ways the origin of some of the aspects of form-based codes, but it's only the most recent of a series. The Greeks had laws about how to make good streets. Laws of the Indies, the early Spanish settlements. When you read them, they have very clear ideas about what makes good civic space. And most usefully, for what I'm going to say, the London Building Acts, not just because they're English, but I know about them because they're English. But they have this basic equation. You control the building mass and what in our jargon we call frontage conditions. That is a useful term. It means how the building meets the street or meets the public realm. So when I lapse into jargon and say frontage conditions, I'm meeting how the building edge, your facade of your project, meets the street or whatever the public space is. And the London building regs controlled, you can see here some of the diagrams, in terms of building height, shadow cast, in terms of street widths. They focused on that. They didn't concern themselves so much with use, but that amount of regulation, that predictability, drove hundreds of acres. Any of you know London, you may know Pimlico, Belgravia, Bayswater. Virtually every bit of London that is fashionable now. Well, even the working class areas were product of these building codes because there were different classes of buildings. So that predictability basically set the pattern for the massive 19th century development of London by both aristocrats, dukes and earls, and also professional developers. Here's an example by a fellow called Thomas Cubitt, who was a professional developer, begun in 1843. This is a part of London called Pimlico, which is near Victoria train station, if anybody knows that area. And it's a prime example of strict facade controls. These were built as townhomes, 1, 2, 3, etc. And the facades very tightly controlled. The backs, not so. The backs are the backs. Not only do you not put the expensive materials on the back, but you sort of push things in and out and put extensions on. And in the 150 years or more, they've been, and they are, all sorts of uses. They're not, sort of slaughterhouses. They're not, petroleum storage units. So use is controlled in the framework of common sense, but use is in terms of those that contribute to a lively, a dynamic area that can change with market pressures, yet not change the character of the place. These codes are really extremely good examples. So, at the risk of this word repetition, and I'm sorry to treat you like graduate students, but if you remember only one thing, it's what I used to say, in every lecture, because we used to talk about a lot of stuff, but there's usually one thing you've got to remember. The true intent of form-based coding, as was said in the introduction, is to change the thinking in the planning process to regulate the public realm, to create great places, streets, squares, plazas, parks, you name it, where people want to be, which are the containers, the crucibles of economic activity and lifestyle and all the things that make it great to be in an urban place. So that's what we focus on. It's not about the private realm. It's not about the aesthetics. It's not about the colors. Uses are regulated to a degree. As I said, you couldn't put a slaughterhouse in that, London terrace. But they're much more lightly and flexibly regulated. And there is a presumption that mixing uses is a good idea, the exact opposite of almost every conventional zoning code of the last 60 years, which was based on separating everything out. So, a quick recap about those, what for us, I was born the same year as this university, right? It says 1946 over there, right? That's me. So, I grew up, you've grown up, if any of you are older than I am, you may have a faint baby memory of a different kind of world, but most of us have grown up in the world where zoning has essentially ruled the way America has built America. The basic principles, which began as government suggestions in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the whole way of thinking about towns, cities, buildings, how the economic engine of the private sector could be restarted after the Depression was to essentially make government money available in terms of guaranteed mortgage systems and all sorts of things. But if you're going to put taxpayer money out there, you want rules and regulations about how it should be spent. And so we get, a lot of government standards. As part of thinking about the future, one of the first things we did was throw out the past. Right? Because if you're thinking about the future, the past is a bit of a drag. Right? So we didn't worry about the past. So we sort of consciously rejected the way America had built itself up until this point. And of course, as all of us started to drive, it was relatively natural that we put the emphasis almost exclusively on the car. And I had to search my memory of where that is. It's a placeless place. It happens to be Tupelo, Mississippi. Not that you'd know it. Because there's no attention to the public realm. All the regulations are what goes on and what you can and can't do inside there. And, how many cars you park there. That's it, basically. Right? Nothing about placemaking, nothing about the character of a place where people would want to be, to want to gather, to want to meet, to want to work, to want to generate economic activity. It's all separated out. And because we all grew up in that, it's sort of normal. We forget that it was a revolution. It was a government-sponsored revolution in how America thought about its future. I'm not saying that's bad necessarily, just as it's government-sponsored, but that's where it comes from. We think the suburbs are the product of the private market. Think again. They're the product of government regulation and government thinking, which made sense at the time. It just doesn't make sense anymore because the world's moved on. Again, you don't have to read this. You can download the file. But there's all sorts of evidence, both from market demographics about boomers and millennials and lifestyles and renting versus buying and all the sort of psychographics that we study a lot. On the one hand, the market wants products that the conventional zoning generally makes illegal or at the very least incredibly difficult. And at the same time, because I do care about climate change, I do care about my 7-year-old grandkids, who when they're my age, it'll be 2075. So that's actually a year I can think about. I'm long dead. But assuming they live my lifespan, it's going to be 2075. So I care about 2075, purely selfishly, but also, you would benefit too by my concern. And so I do worry that the way we build today puts out more emissions than it seems the planet can stand. And that if we built more compactly, if we built the walkable mixed-use communities that boomers and millennials say they want, and which the development industry bravely struggles to provide against the obstacles of conventional zoning, if we did that, we'd also be doing my grandkids a huge favor in as much as they might get a habitable world, they might get a habitable America. One actually is dual nationality, so she can hop it to England if she needs to. But look at the European Union. They're not doing a whole lot better. A little bit better, but not enough to sneer at Americans. Right? We're all in it together. So I do care about the planet, and the market and environmental thinking are coming together in the most handy consensus, which is good news. And this year, 2014, is the 20th anniversary of the first form-based code that I began writing in 1994. And we've learned an awful lot since then. Oops, I beg your pardon. Oh, no dear. How do I go back? Is this going back? There we go. Sorry about that. I was warned my finger was... There's a disaster button, which I mustn't press here, but I was warned about that one. Okay, same message. You get by right project approval and entitlement flexibility in exchange for conforming with clearly defined urban design principles, which generally are not negotiable. They're not part of a hassle process. The code tells you how to make good public space in the same way that I can teach my urban design students how to make good public space. It's not that hard. Good urban design, this is the little dirty secret about urban design graduate programs. Teaching good urban design is not that difficult. It really isn't. The difficulty is in implementation. But the principles of design are pretty straightforward. So this means what codes are. They do regulate the building's form as it relates to public space. They do allow flexibility in uses by right. They do create a reliable set of standards. They do provide for quicker approvals if the code provisions are followed and if the code provisions are clearly written. What they're not, and you will hear, despite everything I tell you, which will sound convincing while you're here, and then you go away and someone will say, well, don't believe that English guy. I mean, the form-based code I had to work with, it did do this, and it did do that. I'm here to tell you it shouldn't have. Sorry, I can't fix it for you. But it shouldn't be doing any of these things. If it's a good form-based code, it should not be doing these. Not regulating style. Not having extended public design review process of every project, because, as we'll see later, that public process should be front-loaded into the development of the community plan and the code that goes with it. It doesn't need to apply to a whole jurisdiction. You'll see examples that we will point out that work well at the small area plan level. And it's not based on aesthetic controls. The only design regulation really is here. And this, as you can see, is the building that's going up on the edge of my neighborhood in Dilworth, that what we're concerned about when I write form-based codes, I'm really concerned about this bit, where the private realm meets the public realm. So I want plenty of doorways. I want doorways, I want windows, ideally stoops, whatever it is, to make this not only an interesting visual experience, but easily accessible, lots of visibility, eyes on the street for public safety. I don't really care what happens up here. Or here, really. I mean, this is the more detailed design. What my codes focus on is this, the basic massing. So this is not a 50-story skyscraper, but this basic 5-6 story mixed-use building. And the codes spend a lot of time talking about the relationship between the building and the public realm. That's urban design. So when I say urban design, that's what I mean. And here's a typical page from a form-based code which deals precisely with that issue of what we refer to as transparency. It's the amount of glazing and how it's disposed in the building facade, so that these basic conditions of making a good pedestrian streetscape, making a safe pedestrian streetscape, making an interesting, visually interesting, all those, if you do all those things, it's active. If it's active, people are there doing stuff. People are there spending money. People want to be there. So these are basic, this is a tabulation of minimum window areas for either a residential or a mixed-use commercial building that are requirements under the code. Now, you can do more than these ratios, but you can't do less. You cannot do less. But there's not a single word about style. This is a numeric tabulation that will guarantee a good standard of street-level urbanism. And you might hear a lot about this word, transect, which is a well-authenticated term from biology and geography. From geography, most particularly, it's like a slice through a landscape, which geographers use to analyze. And this is where Andres Duane and his wife Liz Plater-Zyberk really deserve their place in the history books, because they took that idea of a slice of urbanism from the most rural to the most urban, this is a hypothetical slice, and used that idea not as a tool of analysis, but as a tool of synthesis, as a tool of making places. And from the most natural zone, which is basically undisturbed, to rural, which is farms and other sort of countryside activities, to suburban, generally low density, probably single use, and higher degrees of urbanism. So this is a hypothetical example, which is customizable. I mean, many codes that I write only deal with these three, T4, T5, T6, the most urban end of the spectrum. And you'll see that the more urban you get, the more walkable, the more connected you get, the more uses that are allowed by right. You wouldn't want that degree of use flexibility here in low-density suburbia. Doesn't make much sense. Least of all out here in what is probably a nature preserve. But the more urban you get, by right, you get more flexibility of use. Here's, don't bother with the detail. You can enlarge this on your laptop at home. But here is a page from a code. It deals with one of the more urban areas, a T5. Sometimes in neighborhoods, we abandon this T classification and give them sort of neighborhood-sounding names. You'll see an example of that momentarily. It regulates these things: height, siting, frontage, coverage, location of secondary buildings, and location of parking. In this particular example, all these uses are permitted by right. There are no stipulated density figures. There's no DUA. There's no FAR. That's inherent in the working out of these things that are regulated. Obviously, if you have a building that covers all or most of the lot, you're going to have a higher FAR probably than if your building is just on a little piece. But we're not interested in numbers. As someone said at a meeting earlier, you can't tell. If you're in a neighborhood meeting, you say the FAR is 4. This was your example, I think, Peter. What does that mean? Doesn't really mean anything. But if you say this is zoned as community Main Street, everybody's got an image of what that is. And if you say there's a height limit of 5 stories, which would be like Salisbury downtown, perhaps, or I know there's the Plaza building there, which is 12 stories. But you can, by defining the community character, the numbers, and it means that you've got to think about your pro forma slightly differently, because you got to arrive at the numbers through this mystical process called design, like you need people like me. Right? You need to think a little bit about design, which is the whole point about form-based codes. It brings the design of the public realm right up front where you cannot ignore it, you can't get away from it, you can't screw it up. Even if you wanted to, even if you didn't care about the public realm, the code would make you do a decent job so that the citizens at large would benefit. But I bet everybody in the room does care about doing a good job. But it means that you've got to think about the design clarity of your intention. It's not a pure numerical exercise. Now, here is a plan. This happens to be what was originally an African-American neighborhood just south of downtown Greenville. And this is a reworking. In fact, there is someone in the audience, I will not point the laser dot at him, who was very involved in the reworking of this plan. This is a neighborhood plan we did first in 2002 and redid just a couple of years ago once the recession we were emerging from the recession. And this small area plan designs the potential, not the requirement, but the potential of every property in that small area. There's no colored blobs, there's no asterisks, there's no numerical formula. There's actually design. And then the potential development yield for all the major parcels are worked out in a really arduous and engaging and fascinating upfront community process involving everybody you can possibly think of. And when the city code, when the city plan, when the city adopts the plan, then that becomes a mechanism for the code that will follow. And this is in red, because that really is important. If a developer wants to build a project that fits this planning code, there's no reason to go through another lengthy process. It should be by right. And here is the equivalent of a zoning map. Here is the regulating plan. You can see there are 4 zoning categories instead of your normal 10 or 15 or more. And there's no T1, T5, T4, T6 as things that actually real words. Downtown transition, urban corridor, urban neighborhood, civic space. There are really 3 different zoning ordinances, and each one of them has its own customized version of the transect in the form base. So what this means, you've got 3 basic principles of operation. You hammer it out up front. The plan is adopted. The code is adopted as quickly after, ideally within 9 months of adopting the plan. And then if you follow the code, you get quick and timely approvals. Costs are reduced. You can see the bullet points for yourself. I will not read them out, but you can see them. And here is an example in Nashville, which is receiving a lot of attention because it's the product of this kind of zoning system. So quickly, 2 case studies, and we'll wrap this piece up. This is an example of, this actually is in Somerville, South Carolina. This is the kind of work we do as part of a small area plan, working with individual property owners. Here's me doing a low-density version for his land, which is this bit, and adjacent properties so that there could be a coherent vision and redefining the corridor. This is a higher density vision, working with neighbors, working with property owners to really hammer out what that small area plan should be, and then developing a code. So well-designed form-based codes, again, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bullet points. I won't take time to read them out, but they're all good things we're interested in. Economic development, housing affordability, attracting capital, which in the competitive world, we want capital to come to our neighborhood, to our project, not go to Nashville. But it does go to Nashville because they've sorted some things out very well. And this is in Music Row. There is an urban design overlay. That's what UDO means. And it's extremely dense. No rezoning. I mean, look at this. Just go down through those things. And when you look at the city as a whole, look at the increase in taxable value compared to nationwide. That's not entirely due to a form-based code. It's not that simple, action, reaction, but the form-based code discernibly had a great deal to do with that economic regeneration. Closer to home, in my neighborhood, and I see some folks here from Dilworth, so we know this well. So far, it looks actually pretty good. And this is the bit that was on a previous slide. This is the ground floor, the interface between the private realm and the public realm. It's that interface that form-based codes really focus on. And this is a project which really seems to have a great deal going for it. It promises to be a very, very good project. And so here we have the economic advantages. What can go wrong? Well, you could probably tell me. I've had 20 years experience of what can go wrong. It can begin by the code being a mess, just badly written. It can, not out to name any names here, but planning staff, wherever they are, particularly if they're designers, can start adding their favorite bits to it, which they should not. N-O-T, not. Because once the code is sorted out at the beginning, with the idea that you can revisit and update it as necessary in about a 5-year cycle, but you don't fiddle with it in the meantime. You don't add your favorite bit on top of everything else. Appointed and elected officials, they have been known to balk a bit at by right conditions. Even though they sat in a council meeting or a town board meeting and approved the plan and approved the code, when the rubber hits the road, they say, oh, I didn't know it was like that. I didn't know I approved that. Well, tough luck, you approved it. It's called a democracy. Grow up. Now, which of you is going to say that to the town board, right? But that's what you're thinking. And heaven forbid that the Dilworth Community Association, of which I once was a proud member, and I'm standing for re-election. You heard it here, John? Oh, God, he says. Heaven forbid that somebody like us would backtrack on something we'd agreed to. But the Dilworth folks are good-natured folks. They're actually pretty intelligent and nice folks. It's human nature that someone comes in, maybe I got a new next-door neighbor. They weren't involved in any of this pedscape stuff. And they say, oh, I don't like 4-story buildings. And so neighborhoods can, with some good intention sometimes, undo the good work that has been laid by other neighborhood involvement over many years. So the biggest problem is people. We write it badly, we meddle with it, we backtrack on what we agreed to. We tend to behave like that in our personal lives sometimes. We don't always, we're not perfect people. But the better you write a code, the better you lay it out. And again, the author of that page is sitting in the audience. And it is a very good example of how to lay out a code with a balance of headings, priorities, diagrams. You can't talk about form with respect to lawyers. Lawyers can't write legal language about form. Designers have got to draw it to make it clear. So how can you as a development community help? Get involved. That was me. Get involved. Get involved engage the municipality, press the municipality to keep with what they agreed to. Make sure they honor the provisions, particularly the by right, because form-based codes are meaningless without that trade-off. Better urban design, by right, flexible market approvals. That's at the core. If you mess with that, it's not form-based. You might have the word form in your zoning title, but it's the old stuff of, well, you tell me, we'll negotiate, we'll argue, we'll hassle. Form-based coding, and the way it's been working in Nashville, for example, the council there actually keep their word. And they honor the code. So, you see, we're getting near the end. Summary, last 3 slides. There's the bargain. Good urban design, quicker approvals, by right flexibility. Stay involved. Push that. Get informed. Don't react to form-based code about myths and just wrong-headed stuff. Understand what it is. Understand how it's a tool for you, and then press the other people involved to honor their part of the bargain. Form-based codes are a bargain. Do this, you get that. You policymakers, public officials must, I would bold that, ensure that the codes make it easy for the private sector to develop what the community says it wants. And the community's got to act like adults and not have a tantrum when it says, oh, I didn't realize, I wasn't paying attention. Well, you had your chance. It's like not turning up for the exam. I'm not giving you a second chance. I'm not giving you a special exam. People need to be real and pay attention. This is important business. We focus on the public realm. All the bruising combat between the competing interest groups takes place at the front end. And it's tough. It can be fun. It can be frightening. It can be scary. But it's democracy. It's how it works. In a property-owning democracy, you have your battles up front, you come to an agreement, it becomes law in the code, and then you follow the code. This is my favorite metaphor. When municipalities mess around with a form-based code, they take away the carrot of quick by right entitlements and beat you twice. Very hard. So it hurts. So here we go. If you follow the requirements of the code, your rewards are by right entitlements and flexibility of use. That's the bargain. Anybody messes with that, the form-based code becomes non-operative and you lose all the advantages. Thank you very much.
Thank you to David and for Dustin on his behind-the-scenes work on that. Luckily, I got 2 bites at the introduction here. I was remiss not to thank the Crosland Foundation. A grant from the Crosland Foundation helped us fund this event and bring in our next speakers from Denver. Also wanted to recognize the board members of PPPI that are here, Allison Metcalf, Terrence Llewellyn, Paisley Gordon, and John Tabor. Thank you all for your help. And the elected officials that have joined us, Vi Lyles and Claire Fallon from the Charlotte City Council, and Pat Cotham from the County Commission. At this point, our next presenters were instrumental in the adoption of a form-based zoning ordinance in Denver, Colorado, about 4 years ago. And we brought them all the way from the Mile High City to talk about that experience. Jeannie Robb was elected to the Denver City Council in 2003 and reelected in 2007 and 2011. She represents a district including Denver's Civic and Cultural Center, Colorado State Capitol, and the prestigious Cherry Creek neighborhood. With more dwelling units per acre than any other district in the city, she has a great deal of experience with development and neighborhood issues. She chaired the City Council's Land Use and Transportation Committee for 9 years and she was the City Council President for 2 years during the development of the new form-based zoning code, which was adopted in 2010. Before serving on the council, she served as a neighborhood president, as the chair of the Cherry Creek Steering Committee, on the advisory group for Blueprint Denver, and the city's land use and transportation plan to manage growth and traffic congestion. A graduate of Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, she has been a Denver resident for more than 30 years. And next is Peter Park. Peter served as Denver's planning director between 2004 and 2011, where he oversaw a number of major planning initiatives, including the development of the city's Union Station as a public transit hub, several transit-oriented development station area policies, and adoption of a new citywide form-based zoning code. Prior to his arrival in Denver, he spent more than 8 years as the planning director in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He currently teaches urban planning at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, as well as the University of Colorado at Denver, where he was instrumental in shaping the new Master of Urban Design program. He holds a Bachelor in Architectural Studies from Arizona State University and Masters in both Architecture and Urban Planning from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Please join me in welcoming Councilmember Jeannie Robb and Peter Park.
Thank you. Jeannie and I are very happy to be here and share our experiences. We're going to go through our shows pretty quickly, so I think we can get to a panel. And just to give you some sense, I was, this is not working. So maybe I'll just talk from this slide the whole time. Probably not. I don't know why. I don't know what's going on. It doesn't advance. Here, hang on. No, it's stuck. Let me just reboot it. Okay, so I'm just here to tell you that it's actually possible to rewrite the zoning code and make a new zoning map for your city. It's actually possible. We did it in Milwaukee, where the focus was not only needing a new code to streamline development, but also to make better design possible. In a city that was actually in decline and that we reversed partly by taking out freeways in downtown. In Denver, it's a growing western city in a very different kind of a context of growth and planning and concern that is moving away from what had been a very automobile-dependent growth back to a very transit-based growth. And I'm working in Austin on the rewrite of their zoning code and learned a lot of lessons from these other cities. Again, Austin, a city of significant contrast in many places, is in the midst of trying to decide how much form-based ought to be part of their code. And I'm also working in Los Angeles on the rewrite of that little city's code. All of these cities are dealing with the same thing, and that fundamentally is a zoning code, an old zoning code that has a very different vision. Now, one of the things that I often talk about is you can redo your zoning code, right? It's like software and the hardware in your, you can replace the software and upgrade your software in your computer, but if you still have an old computer, you're not going to optimize the result. And so oftentimes when we think about this, well, in fact, maybe we don't even need software, these floppy disks anymore, right? Things change. And the opportunity of rethinking your code also presents an opportunity to think about how you do planning in the city. In fact, that was a big part of what we did in Denver and in Milwaukee. Planning and implementation, right? Planning is human, implementation is divine. And when we think about how we get to this, there's a very important point, and David made it, is that zoning, for the sake of zoning, is a big problem. If you're spending so much energy talking about zoning, you're missing the point. Because the zoning is a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. And in many cities that are suffering from major zoning issues, it's more of a symptom than the problem itself. In the case of Denver, in the case of Milwaukee, in the case of all the other cities I'm working in, it's really a function of how is planning done and what the role of planning has with regard to the regulations that are in place. Do you have the vision and the capacity? So for us in Denver, and any great city that does great planning, engagement at the front end, right? Engaging the people of the city and identifying what they want. Blueprint Denver is our land use and transportation plan. And from that, It has a very simple strategy of identifying areas of change and areas of stability, because as a city that's been growing and feeling a lot of growth pressures, the areas of stability, the neighborhoods where a lot of new development was happening, scrape-offs and so forth, neighborhoods were pushing back. And in areas of change, along commercial corridors, along areas that were never built, and in downtown, those are the areas that new growth is prioritized for new development. Why is it important? Well, Blueprint engaged a lot of people, but I think the most important thing is Blueprint embraces the notion of urban, of making urban places. And it has a whole range of things that, that address land use and transportation, diversity, building on the existing pattern, not starting tabula rasa and tearing down the old city, focusing on the public aspects of private buildings, making places that are walkable, and capitalizing on transit. And so there are a number of activities that were part of implementing Blueprint Denver. The zoning code update was one of them, sometimes dressing up Mayor Hickenlooper in funny ways to promote our Greenprint Denver plan was part of it. But the main point of this is the zoning code was a major, major piece of implementing the vision. So why zone? There were basically two reasons. The code had become very complicated and unpredictable and cumbersome, and that's never a good place to be. And the code is simply misaligned with the current vision for the city. Those are the two primary reasons in every city that I've been working in that you can really boil it down to. And so what does that mean? Well, in terms of permitting time and predictability concerns, the old code was very complicated. It resulted really from years of incremental change, all good intentions, but cumulatively a very difficult result, which created a cumbersome system of documents, inconsistent processes, and a lot of complexity in the creation of new forms of zoning, new solutions, new band-aids that made the whole pile of regulatory tools even more complicated. This was the original 1923 zoning code in Denver, a little pamphlet. By 2005, it had grown into this enormous volume, as well as a whole bunch of other documents that few people knew where they even existed. It's the law. It should be simple. You know what to do when you see this. Go up 33, 34, you'll probably be okay. But when you see a sign like that, what would you do, right? And sometimes when you read the zoning code, it sort of reads like this, right? Entrance only, do not enter, right? So this is the problem with many of the ways that the laws are written. We also got rid of the FAR system as a unit of measure, which is hard to imagine, I know, but because we cared about form, and FAR 4, right? What we basically have done is we've taught neighborhoods and developers to fight over some numbers, right? You can't believe how many PUDs in Denver are an FAR of 1.72, 5.6, 3.8, like, why 3.8? Well, it's less than 4. Why do we teach people to argue over meaningless things? FAR 4 could look like this, could be 8 stories, could be 16 stories, could be 32 stories, still FAR 4, right? My experience has shown me that neighborhoods understand the difference between 4 stories and 32 stories. Like, people get it, right? They understand form. So why talk about these things? The other misalignment is fundamentally the underlying philosophy and vision of the city, which is to tear out the old thing. This is downtown Denver. And this is an area called Lodo, and this is our Union Station. And the vision in the 60s was to tear it all out. Luckily, it didn't happen. It's a beautiful historic district. It's the strength of downtown. But the other part was accommodating the automobile. High parking standards, all kinds of provisions for setbacks, things that basically create these amazing achievements of humanist civilization, right? Those aren't the best places you can imagine. Those aren't actually things that you would put on a postcard, except those funny postcards that you send your friends, right? So why would we make places like that? In the 50s, updated the zoning code, these houses became non-conforming. And you can see how undesirable they would be. How could you reasonably grow a healthy family in a house like that, right? But, you know, that's really modern, and that's really what the future is about. These buildings have plenty of parking, so we're going to be okay, right? So this is what was going on, is the code was fundamentally upside down to the vision of what people wanted to see. This house was basically non-conforming. That tower was most desirable, right? So it was like, what are we trying to achieve here? So the old code was also very focused on use, right? And a little bit of the physical form of buildings. But really, when we talk about form-based, we're really talking about balancing these things. It's not we don't care about use, because that's just politically deaf to suggest that you don't care about use. But we do care about a better balance of use and form. And the public realm, as David was mentioning, right? So today, much of what zoning results in is the residual space rather than a positive space, and thinking about how do buildings shape the public realm, what role do they play? Planning. We did a plan for a commercial corridor that runs through the full width of Denver. And the plan was really an economic development strategy of how along these crossroads do we create the opportunity for further investment along a transit corridor and more intensive development. When we looked at the old zoning code, you pretty much couldn't get there. But the plan was about creating a sense of a main street on a site like this, for example. Right? We talked about, does that look like a main street? People said, yeah, okay. So that's showing about 4 or 5 stories. What if we said 9 stories or 8 stories? And people would say, no. But if you show them in the engagement process to say, well, it could look something like that. Well, that would be okay. So now I'm not concerned about fighting FIR. Now I'm not concerned about fighting the number of stories if the formal conversation in the planning process actually begins to show this kind of imagery. Under the old zoning, the old B4, that's not text shorthand, although it works, but that was business 4. This is what you could build. High parking requirements, setbacks, this is pretty much all you'd get along a main street. These buildings you could not get. These became non-conforming in the 50s. That building was, Jeannie, a PUD that was 2.5 year negotiation to make a building that looks like it fits in the neighborhood, right? That's a little bit upside down. So coupling the FAR and the parking system and the parking requirements, that became non-conforming, and that building, you see it? That building was conforming to the zoning. So this totally baffled people. How could the zoning not fit our image? But the important thing is we did an updated plan, and we were very clear that we wanted to accomplish a Main Street. So those elements of the form-based, the first introduction of form-based in Denver was about put the building in the right place, locate buildings to define street corners and edges, have ground story activation requirements that create a more vital public realm, have proper transitions to the adjacent context, which in this case is typically single-family bungalow neighborhoods, and provide a wide range of uses. So these kind of form elements step down from the higher buildings along the commercial corridor to the lower density residential areas. And so what you see happening, even chain retail and local businesses can sometimes in fact combine, but they can follow the code. The important thing is they know that, here's that former site. On the site, because of the new code, this new Office Depot and a local gourmet hot dogs went in to fill that corner on that same site. A liquor store was here in a big parking lot, and now a little pizza place, and the new version, a bigger version of that liquor store is there. Pizza and beer, wine, they go together well. But this is what the new code allowed. And another piece of this approach was about context. It's not just the form, but it's understanding that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and that was the big problem of the old code. It sort of treated all single-family neighborhoods as if they were the same in the most urban parts of the city to the most suburban parts of the city. Right? And so in the new code, this became part of the website, became part of an education process to sort of explain what are we talking about in terms of context. Now, David showed you what this is really about. It's those transects. It's the T1 through T6. But in Denver, when we first rolled this out as part of the discussion, people were like, what is transect? What is T what? Right? Context, neighborhood, character. Oh, why don't you just say that? Right, we should just say that. So that's basically the approach. We did this inventory of the various neighborhoods from the most urban to the most suburban, and described what the formal characteristics of them, and then categorized the the zone districts or these different contexts from suburban, these are all primarily single-family residential areas. These become more mixed use and most intensive to downtown. And so we looked at, for example, the block and street pattern of curvilinear streets, no sidewalks, no alleys, shopping centers, to the most urban conditions of sidewalks, porches, alleys, and main streets. And so these contexts essentially operate, and within each one of them, there are a range of zone districts from residential to commercial. So the code relies a lot less on words and a lot more on graphics. If a picture can tell 1,000 words, we're really trying to convey the fundamental elements of buildings and their relationship to each other and to other buildings, as David was mentioning. And this is the typical layout. This is primarily, if you're doing a single-family house, an urban house in the urban single unit A, you just need to look down this column and look at these pictures and you know what to do. It's basically a two-page layout. So the graphic is aligned with height and the tables related to height, the siting, whether you're a corner or a mid-block condition, and the site requirements, and any vertical or design elements are expressed in that kind of a drawing. But that's it. And the point of it is to provide clarity and predictability, not dictate style. All of these buildings, from new to old, fit the new code. So it's not about locking in a style. In fact, it's about promoting more diversity, so that a whole range of building forms and development can happen. And finally, we have one of the largest public transit expansion projects in Denver, and it sets out a whole new opportunity for growing the city and growing the region. We have a TOD strategic plan. We organized a system of what we call station area types, and we map them, and they become the core of how we do planning around stations and maximize these areas of change. And many people say, well, TOD is so new, but in fact, Denver once had nearly 300 miles of streetcar and trolley. The most desirable neighborhoods still in Denver today were originally built along transit lines, right? So it's actually very solid DNA to build a city around. So these plans, when we do them, we are very focused on the relationship of the station area and the surrounding context. I put this out here because we did this plan with this neighborhood and this property owner for a new station area development. Here you can see it's right adjacent to this existing fabric. It's currently a big box center and a kind of a design center area. We did a plan focused on the urban design, the street and block structure, showed images of what the character of the place could be. And then we rezoned it. We did a plan. The plan identified the potential of 5 minimum and 14 stories maximum. When we actually went through the rezoning, the citywide rezoning, this developer site was rezoned consistent with the plan. This developer did not have to pay for the rezoning. Right? It was a legislative matter that the city rezoned with the rest of the city, which was a big deal from a cost point of view. I think the developer hosted a couple of meetings for a citywide zoning. The most interesting part of this story, though, is the neighborhood understood the new code very well and the transition of the Main Street zoning adjacent to where they lived, such that what we actually mapped was a 20-story district. In other words, the neighborhood advocated for more height. I don't know, maybe that happens in Charlotte all the time, but it was kind of unusual. But because they understood how the new code worked, right? And they understood the principle of adding more density. So when we think about code and code reform, and maybe this is something we could talk about as we do our panel, I think about it in 3 primary ways. The format of the code, like a form base uses a lot of graphics, uses a simple procedure, focuses on by right if possible. The substantive parts of the code, the use controls, the heights, those sort of things, and the procedural aspects. What are the steps involved in getting to the permit? What happens, I think, in a lot of zoning codes is these things get really mixed up, and they, in fact, begin to affect the ability to do good plans and effectively implement them. The plans should be the community vision, right? They provide the conceptual foundation. The code is a legal means to that end, and the regulations shouldn't be mysterious, but should clearly broadcast what you want. Most customers, they want a permit. They don't want review. I mean, it's just kind of like that, right? And predictability. They want permits more than review. To get there, we need to link the plans to the vision, but then those need to have reality in the way the regulations are shaped. And regulates the basics. You can't legislate good taste. Right? I've never seen it happen. And communities that, a good thing, have a very high standard of design, unfortunately often becomes we really care about design, so we're going to add more design review. But that actually makes it more difficult because that adds more time. If you actually care about the quality of design and affordability, you would actually make things more as of right. And just don't forget that the best places in the world, quite frankly, were built before zoning. So we can't just rely on the regulations to get to the end that we're talking about. Thank you.
Okay, I know we're very short on time, so I'm a politician. I will make this a show and tell instead of a PowerPoint and just zoom right along. Did it change? Didn't change, Peter. Maybe that way? It's not changing. Let me just tell you what led to our rezoning, how we got there, because most councils want to say, how are you doing it? I know you feel you don't have enough time in Charlotte to get where you want to be, given the intensity of redevelopment. But we got there starting in 1989, 35 years after our auto-oriented code of the 1950s. And that plan, I was, a neighborhood president somewhere, advocated a new zoning code. Then we had the 1990s McMansion craze, and neighbors came to us and said, something's wrong with our zoning. People are shadowing my house. Or we had some development along corridors where the parking lots were in front, development pushed back, and they said, I don't like this transition into my neighborhood. So council did a comp plan. Oops, I'm trying to go fast. Council did a comp plan, and then the land use and transportation plan, Blueprint Denver, Peter talked about. And then I made a separate slide because this is when I was elected, 2003 to 2005, but elected with me were 10 out of 13 new council members. We were all new because term limits had just gone into effect. And we had a new governor who made beer and was a businessman and didn't like a lot of government regulation. And he knew he was left. We'd done all the planning we could, and we could no longer avoid facing a new zoning code. And he brought Peter Park to us, and you can see from Peter how much fun it was to work with him. I don't need to tell you about plans, areas of change, and areas of stability. I will say that our planning department does a great statistic every year in our budget that looks at our areas of change where we're going to put growth, in our areas of stability, and judges permit value, and we get 6-to-1 ratio of value in our areas of change, higher private investment. And in areas with small area plans, we do even better. So planning, even before the zoning, helps tell the community what the vision is. I wanted to talk about Colfax. You saw this slide that Peter brought forward. Trying to see. Okay. I do want to add that my district is sort of that triangle between the CBD, Central Business District, Cherry Creek, and then that UHC, which was the former Health Sciences Center. Very dense area of the city. Colfax, this is what Peter didn't tell you, is the longest and wickedest street in America, which was according to Playboy magazine. It started as a main street and became Highway 40 and evolve to slides that Peter showed you, so I'm just going to whip through them. So that. These are some buildings, different views than Peter showed. I will say, if you look at the upper left-hand corner, that developer came in and he wanted to tear down 3 historic homes in the neighborhood, right next to a historic district. They weren't designated. And the neighbors went crazy. We'd been working on Main Street zoning. We almost had it ready to go. And we said, well, what if we made you our first mapped Main Street zone so that you could move the density up to Colfax? He was going to have low density along Colfax because that's all the zoning allowed. And then in the neighborhood where the density was wrong, the zoning was wrong too, he was going to put the height. So we just reversed it, and we were able to save one of the houses. I do want to add, because one of the big questions was, does form-based zoning spur redevelopment? Along Colfax, this was sort of a council project to improve the streets. So it wasn't just the rezoning, the planning, the rezoning. We also identified catalyst projects and contributed some tax increment financing city loans. This is an old theater that turned into a prominent local bookstore relocated there, and then they added a new section of it that now has the Denver Film Center and a rock and roll store, sort of Twist and Shout it's called. I put these 2 slides in to show you that even the most mundane things, no rezonings, but along Colfax, First Bank had to build it a little higher. They didn't want to do 3 stories. That was our minimum zoning. That's what we hoped to get, to create a zone wall or a street wall. We didn't get it, but their first floor had to be higher, and they had to have that front door on the street, and it made all the difference. And there's a 7-Eleven. I don't really love 7-Elevens, but at least this one faces the corner, comes to the street, has the big windows, not the little windows that you're not tall enough to see in so they can stack their shelves inside. The next thing I want to show you is Cherry Creek. Totally different. The north end of my district, very diverse, high density, lots of different people live there, sort of crazy and wild, like Colfax. The south end of my district, it's high-end shopping. Cherry Creek Shopping Center is one of the top tourist attractions in the state. High-end housing, lots of small houses were scraped for row houses, large houses. And let's see, we started several years ago. It took us about 3 years to do the Cherry Creek plan because development was coming along. Before we started the plan, we had this, and the small building got rezoned to the picture you see of an 8-story office building. That was contentious. We made it through. They didn't show up at council. We worked it all out ahead of time, very negotiated, took about a year. Actually didn't get started building until just this year because the market left. The next slide shows a corner that's just outside of the business district. And during the citywide rezoning, maybe Peter mentioned, at least in smaller group discussions, we didn't rezone the PUDs and conditions and waivers, properties that had specialized zonings. But this one, which fell into that category, the property owner knew what he wanted to do and went to the neighborhood. And we were able to include this in the citywide map amendment. And he went from about a 4-story zone district to the 12-story, which was huge. I will tell you that the neighborhood negotiated deed restrictions that he put on the land in a covenant. And those deed restrictions, this one's just under construction now too, those deed restrictions have been changed 3 times. He's had to go back in and change it with the neighbors because they just weren't sure about how form-based would work. So as I said, we continued and worked through the plan. This rezoning that I put up is also under construction now. There are cranes all over this neighborhood. People aren't particularly happy with construction when it all happens at once. But this is 3 stories near the most neighborhood side of the street, and here's a picture of it along the whole block. This waited from 2009 when we started the plan till 2012 when we finished to come to City Council for entitlement. And it was still a fairly long process, a lot of negotiations. Ultimately, the neighborhood did not oppose it. But this developer, same street, right across the street, it's an ugly old post office, it's been closed for a while, tried to ride in on coattails. The neighbors didn't like the bulk of his building compared to the other, go figure. One seemed to meet the plan, one not. We hadn't put the zoning in place yet. This one faced a lawsuit. The lawsuit was a year. It was going to be an office building. People really worried about parking. After the lawsuit, the property owner sold the property, or as a result, who knows. The new owner is going to make it a hotel, and strangely enough, the neighbors are quite satisfied with that because they see hotel as a lower intensity use requiring less parking. And then the third controversial rezoning I went through down there is across from the other tall building I showed you. And it's a 12-story residential. We hadn't had a lot of residential in with the business section. It was just in neighborhoods, lower density neighborhoods around there. So this went up, and the developer agreed that if the neighbors wouldn't sue, he'd put $80,000 into transportation demand management. I sort of wish he would have put it into redesign of the intersection. But then we started a rezoning process. And what was amazing about this was that the neighborhood was confused actually through the planning process because we put some heights in the plan. And they were confused about the difference between zoning and planning. They really just wanted to get to the zoning, and they kept stalling the plan because they didn't understand the difference. And finally, Peter left, and it kept stalling. I said, well, let's put a working group together to talk about urban form. And really what I was trying to do was have them work with planners to understand that we'll get to it. We'll refine some of these heights we're talking about, and we'll get to the zoning. So we did that, and then we had time and budget. It was about a year after the plan. We actually sat down and did the zoning, and it went so smoothly. Just 3 weeks ago, I rezoned the whole area without any opposition at council. And in fact, there was a neighborhood meeting last night where I went really positive. We didn't rezone PUDs once again, and there was a PUD. And the neighbors are actually, well, we know that probably it should be 8, but we're fine with 12 if it's a hotel. So they're getting there. So the question of it, did it spur redevelopment in Cherry Creek? Probably not. It was already happening. We didn't actually rezone Cherry Creek during the citywide zoning for any reasons. I would simply say it was just too hard. The other reason might be, well, redevelopment was going to happen anyway. We didn't have to worry about it as much. And the third and best reason is we didn't have a plan. It would have been very, very contentious. But once we had a plan, as hard as that was, we got there. One lesson I was going to say, and we can talk about it in question and answers, we didn't redesign an intersection. You can see on the left all the little white pedestrian lines, how many crossings a pedestrian would have to make just to get to the grocery store across the street. I'm going to zip through that. Charlotte talked about, or we heard their city council say that Monday night they heard something like 27 rezonings. It was some huge number. If you look at 2013 on that slide, that's about 33 rezonings for the whole year. So we've really made a difference. You can see where we started in 2000. There were about 11 moratoria through the 90s to 2008 where council just said, we're putting a moratorium on redevelopment. It's too contentious. We don't have the plan, we don't have the zoning. And now this is what we're doing in zoning as a council. My job got easier. This slide shows you that the green were all standard rezonings. The red were still the negotiated rezonings of planned unit development, and the blue, a very small number, had waivers and conditions. And this slide shows you from 2011, when we really were fully into the new code, 2013. The middle blue, the lighter blue, are all the properties that rezoned from the old code to the new code. Maybe they had been a PUD and they thought the new code would be better and clearer. Very few of those were contentious. And the darker blue is, you know, we rezoned thousands of properties in the citywide rezoning. Some people wanted higher entitlement. Some said, well, I don't want mixed use, I want multi-unit or vice versa. So there were, you know, there are always going to be changes there. And I'm going to stop there because I know you want to get to questions.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I know we're past our time. I'm accustomed to, if I'm at a podium like this, there's a timer with a countdown clock. So we don't have that today. We do have a great panel. I understand some of you are pressed on time. If you need to leave, please do that. If you could, you exit through the back. But we've got great panelists, some that have come from Denver for us, some from Virginia Tech. So I'll tell you who our additional panelists, other than the ones I've introduced. Terrence Llewellyn is the president of Llewellyn Development. They develop residential and commercial projects in Nashville and Charlotte. Lindsay McAlpine is the managing partner of CitySculpt. They are a multifamily and mixed-use developer here in Charlotte. And Lindsay's been doing this for more than 2 decades. And finally, we're going to add Jim Merrifield, who's the managing partner of Merrifield, Patrick, and Vermillion, a brokerage development and property management firm with deep roots in Charlotte. He has over 30 years of real estate development experience and directed commercial development of over 4,000 acres of land and 3.5 million square feet of buildings in his career. Finally, I'd like to introduce Tony Lathrop. Tony is a partner at the law firm of Moore & Van Allen, and he also serves as the vice chair of the Charlotte Planning Commission. Tony is going to moderate our panel. I think we're kind of going to set a goal, maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then kind of have a hard stop there and let you go about your day. But thank you very much for staying with us.
All right. Thank you, folks. I want to start with, and move this along, I want to start and ask our developers sort of a 2-part question. Based on your experience here in Charlotte, from where we've come through today, what works with our current ordinance and what doesn't work? And how would you, to the extent you've had experience with form-based elements in your entitlement experience, how would you compare that to the other zonings you've gone through? So I know that's a 2-part question, and partly in the interest of time, but I want to let each of you field it. Jim, you want to start?
Good afternoon. I'll jump on that to say that I think the proof of Charlotte's current zoning is the results that we've got in the city we have, and I think feel like we've been able to accomplish a lot. There's a lot of development, a lot of good development, high quality of life. Are there areas for improvement? Sure there are, but I don't think we have a broken system right now. And if you listen to the speakers and you hear about the potential for form-based codes, you see there are new opportunities out there. We've seen some of that already with the PED and the TOD overlays. I've had the opportunity to work with those, and they are good. But I would be more afraid of the process than I would be of the opportunities that it would create for us. And we've seen the inability of the private sector, the development sector, to effectively negotiate in these rewrites that we've had. And I think recently to the tree ordinance and to the PCCO, and how painful those processes were, how long they took. and how difficult it was, and the results we've ended up with. So I would say, from a developer standpoint, we've been through 6 years of not doing much. We finally have projects and opportunities to work on things again with the economy, and to dedicate the time and the resources it would take to work on a new code, to go through this process, it really isn't very desirable. I understand the city has allocated money for the code rewrite and anticipates a multi-year process, but just because the money's available doesn't mean it's really the right thing to do for us right now. And so I would put out the position that we would be best served to sit back a little and wait, see how some of these other communities do with it, learn, watch, and at some point in the future, if we see greater problems come about, then then make moves. I think we continue to learn from the TOD and the PED. We've seen good results from those. Certainly the South End development that's occurred with the TOD has been remarkable, and we see the opportunity for that going up the North Line, and we can learn. So,
Pass it to Lindsay.
Just to repeat your question, make sure I'm answering what you asked, what's right and wrong with our current code and our experience with form-based codes?
Correct.
So we've got a lot, I agree with Jim, we've got a lot of things that are right with our current code. I probably embrace a form-based code more than most developers just for some experience that we've had. But I would say what's right with our current code may not be right for the city, and it is that people that have been around a long time understand it and we can navigate our way through it. But that's also what's wrong with it, is it's very complicated, it's very political, and just based on relationship or bias, the politics can be such a mess. On the other hand, the form-based code, which we have in effect in these overlay districts, can expedite the process. You can end up with a cohesive plan that neighbors understand what's going to come in the neighborhood because they were involved in the plan. Developers understand what they're going to be asked for without any, one of my great mentors and a former partner with Jim, John Crosland, said that the development process is taking outright, or excuse me, the rezoning process is taking outright extortion and turning it into benign confiscation. And so that process, to some extent, gets eliminated in a form-based code. The other part that I think this city should really consider and embrace is that we have some fantastic professionals here, not only developers, but architects, engineers, land planners, and I made this comment upstairs, and I'm sorry for repeating myself, but we rarely let them spread their wings in design and unique capacities because it gets so homogenized in the process. And I think that's a frustration for Charlotte, and I think in a 100-year lens, we're going to regret that.
And Terrence, I know you've got significant experience in Nashville, so you can speak to that as well.
Sure. First off, I would definitely agree that Charlotte is a great city, and we do have some great real estate developments that have been done here under our current code, no doubt about that. And I think that there are some advantages to the current code. It's known. We sort of know the outcomes, and there's some advantage to that homogeneity. However, I think TOD and UMUD work extremely well. I think the conditional zoning process, when I as a developer look at that, I need to understand that that significantly increases my risk. And so in order to achieve the same risk versus return that I need in order to make a project go, I've got to have better returns. So some projects that might go in a form-based code might not go in a conditional zoning process. And just the fact that the outcome is unpredictable and that the amount of time tends to be elongated and that the project might be materially changed as a result of the conditional zoning process, I think would be maybe a couple of the disadvantages, although there certainly are advantages. With respect to the advantages of a form-based code, I guess I should first say I've got pretty limited experience on that. All the speakers know way more about it than I do. I have done a couple of projects in Nashville, Tennessee, so I know how they do theirs there. It might be a little bit different in other parts of the country. But I think the advantage to the experience that I had in Nashville is that the process was completely depoliticized. Basically the citizens and government of Nashville got together and created a design for the public realm of certain urban parts of Nashville that was very beneficial to the citizens of Nashville, that gave them everything they wanted in terms of how the public realm worked. And that became the code, and we complied with that code. And the advantage, I think, to the developer was that we had a low-risk regulatory environment. We had an expedited regulatory environment, and as a result of that, our risk became substantially lower. So once again, that risk versus return metric that we need to look at, we were able to invest there, and we might not have been able to invest had there been greater risk. And I guess my last point would be, the world has changed a lot in the last 30 years, and two big changes have been transparency of information and transportability of capital. Nowadays, it's very possible to know how favorable and unfavorable various regulatory environments are from sitting in front of your computer in New York or Chicago. And so certain municipalities, I think, whether it's Denver or Nashville or Charlotte, can utilize the code as a means of economic development. And in fact, the code is either a means of economic development or a barrier to economic development. Whether you view it that way or not, it simply is. And to be able to attract institutional investment into your city has got a number of material advantages: more housing, more offices, more shopping centers, more jobs, more economic opportunity for the citizens of that particular municipality. That being said, all of the disadvantages that were presented earlier in the presentation clearly are present. In the event that the code attempts to regulate the private realm, or in the event that the code is changed in a manner that's unpredictable, or otherwise becomes not really the true definition of a form-based code, I think in those cases it would have more disadvantages than advantages.
Thank you, Terrence. Jeannie, I want to ask you a question, and it's in part what we were talking about at lunch. And as an elected official, in practice, now that you've had your new ordinance in effect for 4 years or so, anecdotally, have you encountered a situation where there is something that's coming on by right and it's going to happen under the new code, and then the adjacent or nearby neighbors, property owners, focus on use and go berserk, from a political standpoint? And if so,
Well,
how has that worked out?
I think I'll leave marijuana warehouses out of this. But actually, we had one case that had a lot of press. It was probably a fascinating real estate zoning case study in Northwest Denver, outside of my district. We had a new council person elected in 2011. The zoning code that was implemented recommended a 5-story mixed-use development on a couple of sites right off a neighborhood shopping strip. It was higher intensity, you could argue, but still pretty fitting, and pretty much corresponded to an older zoning, but about the same amount of entitlement right. And the neighbors did go berserk. It wasn't about the use, it was about the density. And they were calling 5 stories high-rises, no high-rises in Highlands. They proceeded to court, and that took a long time. And the good news in all of this is the new council person who was elected came to all of us. She was just thrown for a loop that this was happening to her. And I think they were just testing. The other 2 council people held firm. And all of us said, no, we're not down zoning that site. We sort of gave our word when we did this zoning code update, and we're not going there. And it's not that high. And it's not that bad. So they went to court. The neighbors lost. It got messier. I could be here all day explaining what happened. There is now a new developer coming in who's going to use the pretty good plan the last developer had, and save, as part of this, there was a historic church that in the process we went ahead and designated because we were so frustrated with everything else. But it happened, but council held steady, I guess is where I'm going. You're never going to stop neighbors and the people who say, not in my neighborhood.
And so a follow-on to that, Peter. So when a plan is adopted. All right. Nope, better. So anyway, when the plan is adopted for a particular area, from your standpoint, and things like that start to happen, do you go back and make changes? Have you seen that happen? What's been your experience in that, and how does it play out?
It changes to the plan before it's adopted or after it's adopted?
After.
After. Well, I mean, the one example I showed was actually we did a plan around the station area, and the result was the neighborhood advocated for more height. So sometimes that happens. But yeah, you know, I guess one of the things that we were always very careful about was separating and Jeannie alluded to it, separating the plan recommendations from the actual zoning. So typically in the plan, there's a recommendation, let's say if the intention is to make a walkable urban condition, a minimum height and a maximum height, sort of a range. What actually then might happen in the zoning is it may be somewhere in there, in that range. So the plans are not specific. The plans, because we were really careful not to confuse plans with the zoning itself. That's actually part of the problem that Denver was having before. But the question of the zone district to apply, and in the case of that lawsuit, looked at, and we did this when we looked at the whole city in the mapping of the city. You look at the existing zoning, because from the property owner point of view, right, that's my bundle of rights. You look at the land use recommendation from the plan. You look at what's actually happening on the land, right? And you look at you know, what the actual zoning is. So that there's in the case of that lawsuit, while we identified a 5-story height, that was negotiated in terms of the volume of development is pretty equivalent to the old FAR, but the old zoning had a much higher height limit, right? So the new zoning, the new form-based code actually limited the height, but gave them the same or actually a little bit more volume of development. And the neighborhood was unhappy with even that, right? So, I mean, I think one of the reasons why the city prevailed on that is that the city took a very reasonable approach of balancing existing property rights with, you know, sort of the future. And I think that's one of the things that form-based allows you to do. I mean, the reality of this in Denver, we upzoned some areas of stability. We increased the density in certain neighborhoods and simultaneously created regulations that shaped new development to be more compatible, right?
Let me just add, and I had this as a note in my slideshow that I whipped through. In those areas of change and stability, Capitol Hill, which is just east of the Capitol in my district, you saw a picture of our Capitol, and south of Colfax had high-intensity multi-use residential with high-rises. Peter had a picture with the high-rise towering over the Denver squares. A lot of that got zoned from R3, which was a 3-to-1 FAR, could go pretty darn high, to GRH3, General Urban Row House, 3 stories max. So I would say, and we kept using this word, it's maybe a euphemism, we kept saying we were trying to right zone. We were trying to zone to the context that was there, but balance the property rights that were there. And I think we got it right because, again, we had very little, if any, opposition and a unanimous vote when we did it.
Thank you.
And really, fewer neighborhoods come back and protest it than developers who come back and ask for more entitlements since we did it.
David, question for you. A couple of, you know, I've heard and others have heard concerns about and these were expressed, I think, in some of the slides about cities trying to get too far into aesthetics and micromanaging that. And then on the other hand, also concerns that perhaps form-based codes could produce development, for lack of a better word, I might say is monotonous. And I noticed in your white paper, you made the distinction between design versus aesthetics. Can you speak to that?
That's an important distinction and a difficult one to make in terms of neighborhood meetings, or in fact, you know, I mean, even in a meeting like this with lots of knowledgeable people. Form-based codes, I mean, in my country, they're called design codes because they're about design, which is short for urban design, not building design. So you know, we're already into slight ambiguity, right? But the form-based codes here in America, the good ones, the ones that work as they should, are concerned about the public realm. The public realm is urban design. It's the spaces that we all share, one way or another, about their safety, about their attractiveness, about their economic viability, about their longevity, their adaptability. Like those London, you know, row houses, they're nearly 200 years old. And they're doing just fine as hotels and offices and Lord knows what. So we are concerned about design, and as I showed in the Moorhead Street example, the way that building meets the ground and meets the street is well designed. The rest of the aesthetics, whether it's brick, you know, what the shape of the windows is, you know, how the top story is handled, frankly, I could care less. Right? My job as an urban designer is to safeguard the public realm that we all share and let architects and developers design the private buildings that have a responsibility. Every private building has a public responsibility. And so the form-based codes deal with that public responsibility. And because we hold you to, you know, good urban design standards, you know, like a minimum B, you know, C's, you know, we're not interested in C grades. We want a minimum of B, and we're delighted with A grade projects. We want a minimum of good urban manners. Then what it looks like is up to the architect, the developer, the market, and that may change, particularly in the back of the building, away from the public realm. All sorts of. If anyone's been to Bath, or even watched Masterpiece Theater, or any Jane Austen, you'll see these beautiful classical fronts. Everything perfectly designed. You go around the back, and there's bathroom extensions and kitchen things and staircases, and it's a riot. It's a gorgeous mess around the back because the private realm is doing what the private realm does, which is sort itself out on its own turf. But you wouldn't mess with the front of the Royal Crescent because it's that's a World Heritage Site, so you don't mess with it anyway. But you can do what you like on the back. And so that's a very basic principle. Urban design is about the design of the public space. Aesthetics, building design, we don't want to regulate that. We really don't.
Quick follow on, Peter.
You know, interestingly, the transactional process in Cherry Creek, so a developer negotiates a PUD for a row house, 8-unit row house. Takes months and months and months and months. They finally get approved. And they build it. And people say, oh, good. You know, you built. And they come back, and they have another site, and they want to do 8. And so they figure, should I design this differently, or should I just do the same thing? I'm going to do the same thing, because I don't have to pay for new drawings, and I don't have to pay for the process, because if they liked it the first time, why wouldn't they like it the next time? So they just keep doing that, keep doing that. So I remember that it becomes very formulaic, but that's what makes it predictable. In other words, the first time I did it, it cost a lot of money, but the second time I do it, I just stamp it out and it works. Then the neighborhood started complaining when they came back, and they said, in the negotiation of this PUD, we want it to look different than the last one. From the developer's point of view, it's like, why? That's changing the rules. You were okay with it last time, why do I have to change?
Well, let me shift gears just a little bit and ask our developers another question. And Jim, you alluded to some of the TOD stuff here. In your experience, have you all seen form-based codes? And I'm gonna start calling them community character codes. I'll lobby for that here. I like it better. Having an impact, you know, in actually encouraging retrofitting or redevelopment in declining or distressed corridors. Terrence, why don't you start?
I don't really have any experience on that. I'd like to let one of the other developers.
Okay.
So yes, we have had experience in the with the TOD, and it's been a very positive experience. It simplified the process, expedited the schedule, and it took a little learning curve to understand the rules and to. But once we learned the rules, we're able to adhere to the rules and design to that level, hopefully at a B or higher. And so I think it's a good thing, and I think Todd and the PED have worked well for Charlotte. We've seen a huge investment, particularly in the south end along Moorhead with the PED, and it's been great.
Lindsay?
I would say we're doing a project in Durham, North Carolina now, and one of our partners, Woodfield, I think I saw him in the room earlier, we were astonished when we have a 15-acre site in the urban core, which is by itself is astonishing. And Durham has used their ordinances as an economic development tool. They have a lot of historic renovation. But in this particular case, there were car dealerships with big surface lots. And they said, you know, we really want to see something different here. And we remain astonished at how 120 units an acre is a very low density to what they would like to see. And they're encouraging us to go up and have iconic architecture and unique design. And, you know, all of the team looks at each other, architects, engineers, and everybody says, are they serious, or are we going to get stabbed in the back somewhere? And so, but the great part of it, there's a unified political body there that has learned to use their ordinance as an economic development tool. And this was really a blighted area that we're working in. And so in 10 years, it's going to be an iconic area after it develops out. So it's really fun to watch it in process. And the nitpicking that goes on in a lot of municipalities about this color brick, that color brick, fencing, we're not getting any of that. So again, I go to the professionals, the creatives are really getting to spread their wings and do some really cool things. So.
Thank you. I want to wrap it up because we have run over, but these are great thoughts you all have expressed here and in the other presentations. Joe, do you want to say a few things?
Yeah, I'm Joe Padilla. I'm the Executive Director of REBIC. First of all, thank everybody for hanging with us, and I appreciate it. I know we went long, a lot of great information. We could probably go another hour. We're not going to obviously keep that today, but if you have any questions, you know, certainly would invite you to, you know, come down and speak with one of our panelists for a few minutes if you can. And this is a conversation, I think, as the city goes forward. We know that zoning rewrite is in the works. Our industry certainly wants to be engaged. We hope the community will continue to be engaged. It's going to be something we'll be talking about for a number of years. So thank you for coming today. Please continue to engage where the opportunities exist in the next few years as the city starts that process. And again, if you have any questions, please come down. I want to thank our speakers. Let's give them a round of applause. And you know, particularly Councilwoman Jeannie Robb and Peter Park, who made the trip from Denver and from Boston as well today. And our other speakers as well. And thank you for being here, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.